Dr. Ahmad.
Thank you. Allow me to greet you with the Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. I must begin with invoking the name of God, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and I also must begin by apologizing to both the audience and my fellow speakers for my tardiness. It was due to a combination of things that needed to be attended to at the office and my own confusion as to the number of the panel I was on. But I can be forgiven for that. What I cannot, if you're willing to do so, what I cannot make up for is not having heard all of the presentations before me, as Ambassador Newton pointed out, is the most valuable thing about being on a panel late. And I have squandered that, except I did get the opportunity to hear not only Ambassador Newton make that point, but also to him to make the comment that the Gulen Movement both teaches tolerance and also engages in educational activity. And my talk, which is on the role of education in achieving world peace, ties those two things together. Indeed, I think that education is the most important element that we have in teaching about tolerance and in trying to achieve world peace. But what I'm going to have to say about it may surprise you, because the question is, how do you teach tolerance? Or actually, the question I would say is, can you teach tolerance? I don't actually think you can teach it the way that you can teach a skill. And my first point is to take a look at the amount of violence in and around so many of the schools, the government schools here in the United States. This is not even a new phenomenon. Even in my own day going to school in the public schools back in the 1950s, a relatively genteel time, there was bullying. And there was also gang wars, as is well demonstrated by the musical West Side Story that came out at that time. Now, since we know that tolerance is mentioned as one of the American values that's taught in these public school systems, why is it that it seems to fail to take as far as peacemaking in the school itself is concerned? I think that the problem is that government schooling is only partly educational, as it also has the objective of socialization, and that includes the indoctrination of a sense of national identity that sets a pattern for and facilitates for military enterprises. You can see this in ways that may not be obvious, but the so-called school spirit around a football game. The extreme intensity of the pep rallies and getting students to identify with their school as opposed to another school, where the only difference between the two schools being part of the same school system is their geographical location. What is the purpose of this? We all know it has excesses, as when pranks against another school get out of hand. But even in what it's supposed to be, its positive aspect, what is the positive aspect? And it is to cultivate and facilitate a sense of identity, to be able to identify a sense of social solidarity that is put in the relatively peaceful, symbolically warlike atmosphere of football games or other kinds of sports, but actually carries over very easily into national patriotism and pride. That sense of identity, there is us and there is them. And it's like learning algebra. You know, x can change what it is from one equation to another, but it's always 2x equals x plus x, or however you want. The algebraic formula is always the same. The social formula, the socialization formula, is always us and them. And then later we can change who the us and they are as serves the purposes of the state. Now, this brings me to my first point, which is that there's a difference between schooling and education. Education is something that continues through our entire lives. It's something that begins before we go to school and continues after we've left school. It's something that goes on, hopefully, in the classrooms, but outside of the classrooms. When I was in college, one of the most valuable parts of my education to me, much as I appreciated my college education, I thought it was great, but the bull sessions, so-called, in the dining halls was an opportunity to learn a lot that I wasn't going to learn in the formal curriculum, because I was hearing from other students, not just about the classes they were taking, and therefore picking up information about that, nor about common interests about literature or music or whatever it may have been, but also to pick up on their backgrounds, their experiences, who they were, their religions, their cultures, and so on. So that this is part of that development of education, and also leads in, as I shall argue in a moment, for the feeling of tolerance and the possibilities of peacemaking. Schooling is very functional in terms of training people. If you want to be trained in a particular vocation, for example, schooling is very valuable. It's maybe indispensable, or it's considered to be indispensable for medicine. I suppose one can self-teach teach oneself to be a doctor, but we won't give a medical license to someone who has done so. But in the kind of education we're talking about, or I'm talking about, schooling can only serve a function of facilitation. In fact, the American educational system in particular was not designed to get that kind of education that we are aiming for here, but rather was to prepare students for work in the factory system. All you have to do is look at the pro-public education movement at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and the people who supported it. They were very, very clear about what they wanted to achieve. Well, I think that there's a dangerous premise in education, in seeing schooling as identical to education, and that is the premise that knowledge is a body of facts to be memorized. And this attitude is an especially bad problem in the Muslim world. I think it's a serious enough problem here in the United States, but it is much, much worse in the Muslim world. The idea is that you are considered to be well educated if you have memorized a certain body of facts and you can regurgitate them on command. That's not education. Education is about the ability to think for oneself. And it's interesting to me that not only can we contrast, say, the American colleges with the too many of the madrasas in the Muslim world in order to make this point, we can also contrast the madrasas of today against the madrasas of the classical era. In the classical golden age of Islam, people went to madrasa primarily to study the Quran, but not, as they do today, to memorize the Quran and to be able to regurgitate a certain surah on command, but to understand what it meant. Today, if a student in a madrasa says to the teacher, "What does this verse mean?" the teacher is likely to get upset with the student and say, "Why are you taking this, why are you wasting our time with a question like that? Now let's hear you pronounce it correctly. Let's hear you do the tartil, get the rhythm right, get the pitch right." Whereas when in the old days you studied the Quran for meaning, you got the most valuable piece of education you can learn in school: literacy. The Quran has about 6,000 words. Now, the average person knows about maybe 500 or 600 words in their own language. The average well-educated English speaker knows about 2,000 words. So the madrasa graduate knows 3 times as many words as the average educated American. That's power to learn, to continue one's education, to be able to look things up. It's always fascinating to me that in the Quran, what identifies human beings is different from all the rest of creation. In the very first word of the Quran, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Iqra, read, is man's ability to look stuff up. Most philosophers identify man as the animal who speaks, or the rational animal, the animal who thinks. But there may be other animals who think. Dolphins, some people think dolphins think. Jacques Cousteau said the killer whale was actually more intelligent than the human being. But no killer whale will ever read a book or look something up on the internet. And therefore, we are not limited to the information that we have memorized. That information that we've memorized is just to make it easier for us to be able to access the other information we need. We all remember Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. But in what year did Magellan take off to circumnavigate the globe? At the moment, I don't remember, but I can always look it up. Now, this brings us back, if I'm right in condemning the view that education is the concept of memorizing a body of knowledge, then what is true education? And I think that the poet Khalil Gibran identified it best in his response to that question in his book, The Prophet. Let me read you this excerpt from The Prophet on teaching. No man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. The teacher who walks in the shadow of the temple among his followers gives not of his wisdom, but rather of his faith and his lovingness. If he is indeed wise, he does not bid you to enter the house of his wisdom, but rather leads you to the threshold of your own mind. The astronomer may speak to you of his understanding of space, but he cannot give you his understanding. The musician may sing to you of the rhythm which is in all space, but he cannot give you the ear which arrests the rhythm, nor the voice that echoes it. And he who is versed in the science of numbers can tell you of the regions of weight and measure, but he cannot conduct you thither. For the vision of one man lends not its wings to another man. And even as each one of you stands alone in God's knowledge, so much each one of you be alone in his knowledge of God and in his understanding of the earth. I think the opening line of this verse, these verses, is the critical one. No man can reveal to you aught but that which already lies half asleep in the dawning of your knowledge. The duty of the good teacher is to facilitate that understanding that's going on within the brain of the student, not to be a pitcher that pours knowledge into a waiting vessel, but a stimulant. Now let me give you as an example my own personal experience with the social sciences. I hated the social sciences in high school. I loathed them. I'm sure that that was a contributing factor to my going into the natural sciences and why I became an astronomer. Social sciences, history, geography, and the teachers said as much. I remember one teacher said, the only way you're going to learn geography is by rote. Memorize a whole bunch of facts. This was boring to me and meaningless. And knowing I could always look this stuff up, it seemed to be pointless besides. Thus, I was shocked when I went to college and I had to take even I was already made up my mind I was going to be an astronomer. But at Harvard, you've got to take a well-rounded curriculum, and that was fine with me. I was looking forward to the humanities courses and those things. But the social sciences, I thought, boy, this is going to be awful. But there was one course that looked kind of interesting, 6 Revolutions in Western History. So I took it. And I was astonished. It was totally different from what I had been taught in high school. This was not a list of unconnected dates and places. This was a drama that unfolded with forces and that took place within it, social forces. History was a stage on which you were seeing a dynamic process take place, that if you studied it correctly, you could understand underlying principles that were at work. In other words, the serious study of the social sciences, the serious study of society, could be a science just like the serious study of the heavens was, something that had never been exposed to until I got to college. Now, I could be educated, which I could not have been earlier, because I had a new understanding of what the social sciences were about. And of course, while I was a practicing astronomer and astrophysicist for many years, back in the 1980s, I ended up switching fields and have now been engaged certainly since the early 1990s. I have been working in the social sciences, doing work in political economics, especially as relates to Islamic studies. Well, that's just my experience, but it confirms what I think is a general principle. And one of the reasons for changing, by the way, was because I felt the people who were doing the social sciences regards the Muslim world and Islamic issues were people who were uneducated. They've been very well schooled. They had degrees, but they didn't have the education. Now, since I've gotten into the field professionally, I realized that I was too harsh. There are a number of very fine people doing work in this field. It's just for some reason they seem not to have a lot of influence once upon a time. Fortunately, things are changing. Now, let us bring another issue on this schooling versus education. Have you ever noticed how many of the leaders of terrorist organizations or the advocates of terrorism are engineers and doctors? Now, this by itself should prove that schooling is not sufficient to inculcate tolerance or to achieve peace. Now, of course, partly this is because so many educated people in the Muslim world go into engineering and medicine. And so there's sort of a selection effect. For every one engineer or doctor who advocates terrorism, I can name 10 or 100 who are opposed to it. So it's a little bit misleading, but not completely. It still illustrates the point that just because you have learned how to be a doctor or an engineer is not going to make you a peaceful person. Something else is required. Well, what is that other thing that's required? I think that we can look for it when we understand how frequently cosmopolitanism is associated with tolerance. We tend, and with a little bit of actually discrimination, to associate a more tolerant attitude with urbanization or cosmopolitanism. If you were raised in Brooklyn, New York, and your neighbors are of various ethnic backgrounds, you tend not to be as ethnically biased or bigoted as you might find in some small rural community where everybody has identical ethnic background. This is because when we know one another as people, then we see one another as human beings. Direct knowledge is best, but a liberal education can also help. Example of direct knowledge, the oil industry. When I first met people in the oil industry, I was astonished at how empathetic they seemed to be with Muslims. And then I realized it's because so many of them had lived in Muslim countries. They knew Muslims. They were not going to be affected by the stereotypes they were going to see in television or movies because they've seen the reality and they know that that's nonsense. Similarly, you'll see a difference between the stereotypes Muslims have of the Western world, between those who have actually been in the West, who have maybe had dinner with an American non-Muslim family, and those who have never been here, never met any people here. Well, if you can't have the direct knowledge, can education make up the difference? And my argument is going to be yes, not completely. It's not a perfect substitute, but it goes a long way. If you can read about other cultures from unbiased sources, or better yet, from those sources in that culture itself, it gives you, if you can mingle in an educational setting, as I did at college, for example, with the Vietnamese. When I was in high school, I was a supporter of the Vietnam War. When I was in college, I was against it. And the main factor changing my mind was meeting people from Vietnam, who gave me a dimension of what was going on there that I lacked when I was just a high school student reading the newspapers. So let's take a look at the education of the Peacemakers. I'm going to select it for study Jesus, peace be upon him, Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and also we're going to throw in Fethullah Gulen for obvious reasons. You'll notice I've omitted Obama despite his winning the Peace Prize. I'm not going to get into that. Let's just say, let's set that aside for now. What do these people have in common? Well, let's take a look at their education. Well, Jesus may be a little bit unfair to include in this group. After all, he was taught by God, or at least that's what we, the believers, the Muslims and Christians, believe. But even if you're not a Muslim or a Christian, you have to realize that Jesus was considered a rabbi, and therefore he had a rabbinical education. He had that strong emphasis on education that exists in Judaism in general, and that he himself obviously embraced it quite strongly, since he's reported in the Bible to have debated with the rabbis even when he was still a child. The other thing is, besides being highly educated, he was open. He did not just talk to the scribes and the Pharisees. He talked to all the people. In fact, he mixed with all the common people, even the prostitutes, even the thieves. His teaching was original, is another interesting factor of him. He didn't simply rehash what the Pharisees taught. He argued with them. He had his own perspective. He came to his own conclusions, and he would speak for them. Now we look at Thoreau. Thoreau went to the prestigious Concord Academy, and he went to Harvard University. But Thoreau was not a cosmopolitan in one respect. He did not travel much outside of Concord. He boasts of the fact of his travels are in Concord. But Harvard would have exposed him to that broader world as it did for me. He was also original. His originality was extreme. He even chided his mentor, Emerson. There's a famous story when Thoreau went to jail for opposing the war, that Emerson came to visit him, and Thoreau said, and when Emerson said, "What are you doing in there?" Thoreau said, "What are you doing out there?" Gandhi went to the University College of London. He traveled to England, South Africa. He read Thoreau and the Quran, so he was obviously very open as well. Martin Luther King attended the Atlanta University Laboratory School and the Booker T. Washington High School. And because of his high scores, he went to Morehouse College. And even without having finished his education from Booker T. Washington, he skipped both the 9th and 12th grades. He entered Morehouse at the age of 15. He graduated with a BA in sociology. Well, I won't go into more details because I think I'm running out of time, but you can read Martin Luther King's biography and see that he was a highly educated man, but he was also an original thinker, as I said, and he was obviously a very open person as well. Now, Gulen's education may be seeming anomalous. His schooling was in an informal Islamic education, but I say it was consistent because he was self-educated and he was open and he was sucking up reading. You can see from his references to all kinds of Western literature as well as Muslim literature, Turkish literature, that he was someone who was interested in learning as much as he could. I don't know what his mentors facilitated his education, but we know that he has facilitated the education of many. So this brings me to the final stage. From this, can we draw an educational paradigm for peace? What I see is the common thread among these case studies that I've made of education of peacemakers. They all had a high level of education, even if it was self-education. They all were open to everything, not focused on a narrow source of learning. They were all original, and I didn't mention, but it should be obvious, they were all spiritual. Every one of them. And this is the thing that is often overlooked by people who claim religion is the enemy of peace or the cause of war. I would say that the opposite is true. It is people with this kind of spirituality who become the peacemakers, who unlike Ayman Zawahiri, who's highly educated but is not a peacemaker, he lacks that element of spirituality. So we need high standards, we need openness, we need critical thinking, and we need spirituality in our educational paradigm. And of course, this is what the great insight of Fethullah Gulen in his schools and why I think they're so successful. It is interesting, he started out as just a preacher, and he decided in the middle of his life that he was going to focus on education. And he started all these schools, and I think that that is the real secret of his success in bringing about this spread of tolerance and peacemaking, was that he is focused on these elements that I have highlighted in my talk. So what can we do? One, become a mentor. The Prophet said, those of you who are here, tell those who are not here. Every one of us has some knowledge that we can share with others, especially with young people. So go out and do it. Try to not pour our knowledge into their heads, because I said that's not going to work, but try to stimulate them, as Khalil Gibran said, to get them to think for themselves and to adopt these attitudes of spirituality and openness. In the Gulen schools, it's interesting that the teaching of values is by example and by extracurricular content. Gulen schools do not try to sit people down and say, okay, now we're going to tell you how to be tolerant. I said that wouldn't work, and in Turkey, of course, it would be illegal to do that, which is the home of the Gulen school movement. So instead, the Turkish Gulen schools have the state curriculum, but the teachers are people with values, who live exemplary lives, and who are open to extracurricular contact with the students. So they not only serve as inspiration, but they can also develop direct contacts. The other thing is, I think that gets overlooked, is to give young people responsibility. Give them responsibility. Sometimes this is thought of as keeping them busy. Idle hands are the devil's playground. You keep a student busy, he won't get into a gang. But it's more than that. Don't just give them busy. Don't give them busy work to do. Give them something that requires responsibility. I think the reason kids, high school students, get into gangs is because we're treating them in the high school process as if they're in elementary school. And they're not. 15 is the age of adulthood in Islam, 13 in Judaism. So we have adults who are being treated like little children. They're going to go out and they're going to get a job keeping books for the drug dealer. the gang. If we're not going to give them a job as the bookkeeper or the treasurer of some at least high school organization or extracurricular organization or something. Responsibility is the key, and there's no better way to learn than by experience. I apologize if I've gone over, but I hope this has been of some value to you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.